It's Monster Mondays with me, Geoff Arbuckle. It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hey everybody, I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. Now, for this month, I wanted to try something a little bit different. For each episode of Monster Mondays in February, I'm going to talk about a different take on one of the oldest creatures in folklore and collective consciousness in general. One could say the creature is long in the tooth. Thank you. I'm here all week. All right. Fair enough. In all seriousness, this month I'm going to talk about vampires. And even though this first week is all about the big cheese of them all, Dracula, old Vlad ain't the only vampire I'm going to talk about. And to be honest, I'm going to look at vampirism from 4 different angles as it pertains to our modern sensibilities. The gothic horror, the sexualism, globalization and corporatization, and as a disease. Sure, I could probably go into much more historical reference, but gosh, myths of blood-drinking supernatural beings have pretty much been around for as long as written human history, and probably even longer than that. First up, it's 1931's Dracula. Yep, as if I could possibly pick something else to represent the gothic horror angle of vampires in modern pop culture. I also felt it was time to kind of double dip back into the Universal classic monsters as well. So as I mentioned in the Monster Mondays for The Mummy, Dracula and Frankenstein came out like 8 or 9 months apart and signal what I think most people would say is the official beginning of the Universal monster cycle. Frankenstein had much more to say about the human condition and was considerably more popular at the time and even to this day. However, Dracula is really where it began for Universal. Much like The Mummy, the argument can be made that Dracula doesn't really have any direct sequels, in the same sense that we think of sequels today. Yes, Dracula's daughter and Son of Dracula did pick up from the conclusion of the original, but I struggle to say that they are much more than passing continuations. Less than direct sequels, but maybe more than the in-name-only type of sequel. It probably wasn't helped out by the fact that Bela Lugosi wasn't involved in the continuing story like Karloff was for Frankenstein or Lon Chaney Jr. was for the Wolfman. As a side note, you might realize that generally Frankenstein is used front and center in most of the artistic representations commissioned by Universal to promote the Universal Classic Monsters brand. Additionally, you may notice that Dracula maybe only has a sort of passing resemblance to Bela Lugosi. There is a financial and business reason for that. Of all the actors who originated characters in the Universal Monster cycle, Bela Lugosi's family is the only one to not license his likeness to Universal for use in merchandising, citing they inherited those rights from Bela himself. If you buy a toy of Dracula or an art print with him on it directly licensed by Universal, it is usually a different likeness of the creature. It has not been legal for Universal to use Lugosi's face in that way since 1966. So Dracula tells the story of an old Transylvanian count who purchases land in London. And as it turns out, the people around Castle Dracula are plenty okay with the count taking off for London. At first, some of the Londoners are happy to receive the old world count and his charms. Well, that is until people start suffering from weird bites on their neck, loss of blood, and anemia. 2 women in particular who are preyed upon by the Count are Lucy Weston and Mina Seward. These are 2 friends. And Lucy is killed by Dracula from his feeding on her blood. When she returns to life as a creature of the night who lures and feeds on children, Professor Van Helsing realizes they are dealing with a vampire. And when Mina is bitten and seduced by Count Dracula, Van Helsing, played by Edward von Sloan, who I previously mentioned in The Mummy, and Mina's fiance John are pressed into a race against time to defeat Dracula before Mina is forever turned into an evil vampire. In high school, I read the original novel Dracula that was written by Bram Stoker. If you are curious to read something that uses a vastly different style of narrative than what you typically see in mainstream works of fiction, I'd highly recommend it. It is entirely told from witness accounts, letters, journals, and transcripts from phonograph recordings. We receive the story from the protagonist and provide neat first-person insight on the goings-on brought on by this monster. The 1931 movie is based on a Broadway play based on the novel, but keeps many of the major key ideas and characters in place. In 1992, Francis Ford Coppola made a closer adaptation of the novel, but made minor tweaks here and there for dramatic effect. It's a worthy adaptation for sure, but I kind of feel like it will be just about as close as we will ever get to a direct adaptation of Stoker's novel. For the most part, I kind of feel like the original novel is almost impossible to directly adapt for a couple of reasons. First, as I mentioned previously, the narrative jumps perspective from one character to the next and reveals the internal struggles the characters are facing. Most movies have dialogue and scenes featuring multiple characters and usually shouldn't be narrated by the character's thoughts. So it's kind of a thing that is best suited for the printed page. Second, the 1931 film brought perhaps the most important character development for Dracula, and that's Bela Lugosi himself. The Dracula of the novel is old and grows younger as he feeds, but is still a creature of the night and relatively ugly and off-putting. Lugosi's acting ability, his then inefficiency with the English language, and his debonair appearance has, for the most part, carried through the near 90 years of films that followed. Sometimes you see vampires as monster-like creatures, but Dracula really has two depictions, Lugosi's and Christopher Lee's from the Hammer productions. If you don't want to do Dracula in the style of Lugosi, you normally go with the Lee route. If you don't want a Lee-style Dracula, you normally went with the Lugosi style. However, despite Lee's own success as the Count, you can say the word Dracula to any stranger on the street, and they will probably immediately think of Bela Lugosi, or the tuxedo-clad man in a cape with a medallion. I've got more to say about Lugosi in just a few minutes. But first, let's talk about my three things that I love about this movie. First, the gothic stylings of the sets and the staging. Almost everything you can possibly think of as being tropes of Halloween decorations or horror movies, like spider webs, creepy crawlies, bats, ruins of various different locations, gothic-style castles, and so forth. It almost entirely can be linked back to 1931's Dracula. These are the early days of horror in cinema, and there have been thrillers and mysteries and horror before, but nothing quite like this. It's slick, but also kind of quaint. When you watch the movie, it feels like you should turn the lights low, cozy up on the couch, and watch while you wait for the next round of trick-or-treaters to knock on the door. The second item I appreciate is the absolute lack of a soundtrack. Sound in film was a very, very new thing when Dracula came out. It was one thing to have a live orchestra playing in the theater for a silent movie, but for these new talkies, connecting a score to the rest of the sound and dialogue wasn't terribly common and wasn't easy to do. The only music you hear in the entire movie is the opening and ending, and when the main characters first meet Dracula just after a theater performance. The atmosphere is one of the things I mentioned about with The Mummy, and it's pretty much the same type of feeling I get here. The lack of a soundtrack gives this entire movie a dreamlike quality, and while not every Universal classic monster movie uses the same gothic or dreamy atmosphere as Dracula or The Mummy, one of the reasons why I could really go back to this and spend every October watching many of the series and watch them as many times as I could is that it can create a spooky vibe. The black and white probably helps a whole lot with setting that mood and that tone. Finally, how can anyone talk about the 1931 Dracula and what they like about the movie without mentioning Bela Lugosi himself? It's probably safe to say that Lugosi was made a star after the release of this movie, but it's really kind of more about the way he spoke, the rhythm of his words that kind of dance along the spooky scenery. His hand gestures, these are all things that are still impersonated to this day. And I honestly believe that there are few actors who completely and totally crush a particular part or character. Even great actors like Jack Nicholson or Meryl Streep usually stay within a certain margin for all of their performances. It's hard to see one of them in a movie and not just think they are pretty much playing themselves. That's not a slight on them at all, but you have a particular expectations of what they bring to a role. Lugosi, as great as he was as an actor, is no Streep or Nicholson, but exactly twice in his career, he absolutely crushed performances. The first is here in Dracula, and the second, well, that's a story for another time. Now, if I may, I'd like to give my own personal commentary on Lugosi and his legacy for just a moment. It is terribly unfortunate that he couldn't quite have the career that Boris Karloff had. Sure, Lugosi would be employed somewhat regularly for the next 2 decades, but not terribly gainfully employed. When his son was born in 1938, he actually had to take a loan out from the Actors Fund of America to pay for the hospital bills. Whether or not the supposed distrust and rivalry between Lugosi and Karloff is real, I can't help but to feel sad for how Lugosi was often considered second rate to Karloff. Sure, Lugosi had his chance to play the Frankenstein monster, but turned it down to his own preference of not being heavily made up in makeup and monster makeup. He really kind of liked to have his own face and his own presence kind of show through. But when Universal's executives changed in the mid-30s, monster movies were kind of on the outs, and Lugosi was unfairly shuffled off to some real shitty B movies. History may remember him fondly, but he had a real tough career following Dracula, and due to sciatica that developed from wounds that he suffered while he was serving in the military, he was indeed addicted to terrible opiates like morphine and methadone. It's a truly unfortunate decline to an actor who was one role away from being Universal's one and only horror star. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure each and every Wednesday, and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. And also be sure to check out my new post at my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.